everyone. I'm Bharati, and I believe this is our last fellow presentation. So thank you so much for being here and bearing with all our presentation. So my presentation is titled Tackling Innovation Barriers in Frontier Markets. So a little bit different than, I think, like purely tech and digital strategies, but I think, for me at least, it's like much more comprehensive given like, a lot of things that we learn in tech, sorry. So very much, Adrian, I think you're taking growth econ, so you'll see a lot of similarities there. So just very quickly, within the agenda, I'm going to do a brief project overview where I'll talk a little bit about the background, the audience my project is intended for, my issues and solution, where we'll spend bulk of the time, where I've done a lot of like interviews and sort of like deep dive in 3 regions, and I'll talk about some of the issues there. And lastly is a takeaway for entrepreneurs, because those are my primary audiences. Okay, so I hope these are some things that you guys have been reading in the newspapers. So basically, innovation in developed economies in many ways is leading the path for growth and development. I mean, whenever you look at news, you'll see all these like, EU, South Korea, all these different countries. When it comes to like development, it is very much concentrated on tech. Right now, it's all about AI. So whereas if we look at emerging markets and like frontier economies, very much they're lagging behind in innovation and entrepreneurship. So the genesis of my project really comes from sort of like asking why there is a gap here, and really trying to think about, okay, what can entrepreneurs in these developing, specifically emerging and frontier economies do to sort of like combat some of these barriers that they are facing. So the big takeaway really, I'll just tell to any entrepreneurs here well, I'm from Nepal, so if you're from like a country like mine, is that you really cannot copy playbooks from mature tech companies. So like, I had a friend who looked at like Google's like, business model, like when they started, and he's like entrepreneur in Nepal, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna like copy this. And I thought that was like a really weird assumption, just because, where we are, even when Google started in US, we're very different in Nepal. So pretty much, I would say like the first takeaway is like, if you're using that playbook, it really doesn't apply to you just because of the economy that you're in, the constraints that you have. So really, you need to understand that you're facing a different set of challenges and constraints. Once you understand these unique challenges, you understand we're different, and then you can draw lessons from actually other countries and other companies within those countries which have successfully tackled some challenges that might be more similar to you. So the main goal, again, for my project is to really create a first step helpful guide. It's in the form of a questionnaire, which I'm targeting my audience, which is budding entrepreneurs, as well as if government or non-governmental agencies who work in this sector, if they're interested, they can use that as a template. The key questions are twofold. One is, what are the constraints and pain points of innovative entrepreneurs that in emerging markets they're facing? The second one is, what lessons can they draw from success stories of companies in the emerging and frontier markets? Methodology, so I've really focused on interviews with companies in Nepal. It was quite easy for me, so I focused on that. The second is, I actually got a chance to actually talk to some VC companies, people who have been in the VC ecosystem within South Africa. So just like talked about, what are sort of the challenges they're facing and how they're combating it. And lastly is a review of my own, of like research based on some of the success stories of companies in Southeast Asia. The reason why I'm choosing these is like, I'm like starting from entrepreneurs in Nepal, so I didn't really want to like focus on China, because that's, again, China, India are like much more mature economies. So I wanted to focus more on like places like Vietnam, Indonesia, where there are similar development problems. So just very quickly, these are the companies that I conducted interviews with. Pretty much focused, these are all like tech companies. So they work in transportation, logistics, retail, e-commerce, and digital payments. While these are very diverse industries, what I found is that their pain points are very similar. One caveat, these are all from Nepal. So obviously, there's a reason why these pain points might be similar. But I also have like discussion of other companies as well later on. So in terms of like the big pain points that we have from the companies that I interviewed, I would say the biggest is that weak institutions. These countries have really weak institutions, both from a governmental standpoint as well as corporate governance, and that's like causing a lot of problems. High turnover rates, so this speaks specifically to the human capital, and just like the people, it's really hard to find good people. If you find good people, it's really hard to motivate them to stay. A lot of people like me are brain drained. They leave the country once they learn, they can like earn more in other countries. And lastly is the lack of investment and infrastructure for people to like really invest. And when it comes to infrastructure, we're talking about both about the data and technology. They're really, I mean, digitization is, like, I worked in digitization previously. Some of my clients, my project was in digitization, and I thought like, oh wow, this is very painful. But if you go to like some of these other countries, like everything is written by hand. Sometimes there's nothing recorded. So that's like a very painful process, especially when you think about like services and like efficiency, right? If you don't have this information, then how are you gonna help bring efficiency? One problem, which is a little maybe unique to at least my interview, was language barriers. So a lot of people that I spoke with are these like young entrepreneurs who were kind of educated in abroad, and they're going back home to like create these like new companies. But one of the things that I also face this problem is that we are all English educated, but then when you come to like a lot of like countries, I know I can just speak for maybe South Asia in general, a lot of the government documents are written in your national language. So for Nepal, it's Nepali. For India, maybe it's in Hindi. But problem that happens is like, we actually find it really hard to read that document, and kind of like, you have to like register your document through all these processes. And this actually is like a really big impediment, because you pretty much depend on your government, like whoever you go to tell you, okay, you're not writing this correctly. And there are not a lot of like businesses that help you adapt this, because more and more people, there's like a huge divide between people who can like only speak Nepali versus people who literally only do everything in English. So that's like a kind of like a unique problem. Just in terms of, I would say like two things in terms of like bureaucracy. One of the things that I kept on hearing from a lot of people, which I thought was really funny, because one of the things that I used to work on previously was like company registration, that kind of stuff for my clients in my previous life. In countries like Nepal, and I'm sure like similar countries, registration, just to find that information on which government agency to go to register your company is very painful. Just because it is so decentralized, all this information, you cannot Google this. First of all, if you Google it, you cannot Google it in English. A lot of people don't know how to type in Nepali. So like, these are like sort of like problems that actually will really impact your timeline, especially if you're like somebody who wants to go home and kind of like start your company right away. The other thing is in scalability. So we talk a lot and talk about like access to capital markets. Before, I guess, this year, things were really great. You just need a pitch deck and you get the capital. Things are really different in other parts of the world, where getting access to capital is really hard. A lot of times you have to rely on self-funding. A lot of the people that I spoke to within those companies, they're putting their own money and savings to start these companies. You have some help from government. We'll talk about this a little bit in case of South Africa. How African continent is very heavily dependent on government funds. But in general, there's not a lot of like VC fund coming in. So something to think about if you guys are ever interested in like starting a company in like, those parts of the world. Okay, so overcoming barriers. So we talked a lot about, I just talked about like different kind of problems. So I want to like talk more about like solutions. And these are solutions that I found it very refreshing, because instead of just like looking at what is published, there's a lot of literature published in this topic. It's very, for a growth econ perspective, is something that people talk a lot about. But then I think it was like really interesting to actually hear from somebody who was in the field, has worked within the African continent, and like their perspective. One thing to notice, like immediate takeaway, as Craig, who I spoke to, has said, is that a lot of people, when they come in, especially foreign entrepreneurs, especially in Africa, they really come in thinking that I know everything, I've read everything, I have a lot of money, I'm gonna like invest in this like emerging market, right? But he said like the biggest problem was that they lack empathy, and they just like think of Africa pretty much as this like giant continent where everything is similar. He really was actually kind of like very brass about the fact that, this is not one country. They're different, a lot of different countries, they have their own things that are problems, but then there are also like things that are very great, like solutions. And we'll talk a little bit of examples in just a bit. But if you don't think about localizing services, then you'll definitely fail because there's not one key solution. So in terms of like talking about central challenges, the big challenge is a limited access to capital. So you might have seen a lot of headlines that there's a lot of like capital going in to the African market, but then right now the distribution is very uneven. It has to do with like weak institutions where a lot of the access, even if you have money, it only comes to like a couple of people who have done this again and again, right? Oftentimes women and disadvantaged groups, they really do not get any money from all these like fundings coming in. Another more tactical thing that is like really hard is bad term sheets, because a lot of FDI is coming from foreign actors. They have a lot of say, like, they can give you a bad term sheet, and if you're a budding entrepreneur who has a great idea, you might not know what a good term sheet looks like. So that actually makes it really hard for these entrepreneurs to really grow their business. They might sign something bad for like, next 10 years, and that really harms their business. Last one is a product market fit alignment. So this is like, again, going back to like, there's not one answer to like different markets in Africa. You really need to like understand the local market strength. So I'll give you guys two specific examples. So Nigeria versus Kenya, those are like two big countries that like come up whenever we talk about the African market. So Nigeria has like really great, has very high mobile usage. So it's like 83%. However, nobody uses cash, nobody uses digital payment in Nigeria. So even though you have like these mobiles, nobody uses like mobile payments. So if you're like trying to go into like coming with this strategy of like using digital payments, it's never gonna work in Nigeria. It's very cash-based, right? Whereas Kenya and Rwanda, Egypt, much smaller economies compared to Nigeria, lower mobile penetration, but like 90% of their, a lot of their business happens through mobile payments. So these are the kind of things that you need to understand if you're going in trying to establish businesses there. If you're not aware of that, your business strategy is basically gonna fail in certain parts, like big parts of the economy, right? Another sort of like understanding the local market is like the importance of language. So if you're thinking about like going into Ivory Coast or other French-speaking countries, you need to have the language. Like if you do not have the language within your app or your business, they're never gonna adopt this. So another thing to think about, like localization. Some other solutions that talks about limited access to capital. So some of the things that people are doing in the VC market, at least, which I thought was like very nimble, is WhatsApp groups. If you're not from US, I think you guys understand the penetration of WhatsApp, and it's like being used for not just like your family communication, but then there are a lot of like regional VC fund and then accelerator programs. We pretty much like run on WhatsApp. So if you are invited to be part of these like WhatsApp group, they will vet these like investors. They'll give you some access to some like, meetings that might be happening, accelerators programs that are taking place. So to have access, and then WhatsApp, everybody can have WhatsApp in their phone. It just makes that barrier to entry really less. So that was one thing that Kirk was saying, that's actually giving a lot of hope to young entrepreneurs who might not have other things going on to like, join these kind of like elite investor groups. They also do like, one of the things that he said I thought was really funny was naming and shaming bad actors. So in these groups, say there are some international companies who really did a bad deal for domestic companies. They're not shy about naming and shaming people. They will publish articles and do a lot of other things to make sure that domestic entrepreneurs are protected. So some of these things I thought was like really interesting, at least for thinking back to like Nepal and other places. I think a lot of these things can be adopted for entrepreneurs in other emerging economies as well. And then now I also looked at lessons from tech and startup companies in Vietnam, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian countries. The reason behind this is really that, if you think about like economies in a lot of like Africa and like maybe Nepal and um, some countries that lag behind, the next step is not really going to be China. China is very ahead. So I think the next step really is going to be like places like Vietnam and Indonesia who still have problems, but they have been able to come up with like really innovative companies that are changing the game in terms of like startup in these areas. So some of the companies that I looked at were Grab, Shopee, Tokopedia, and Gojek. Happy to kind of chat about what they all do. Very cool companies. But then the main things that I got away from my research is like, you really need to think like the winners. So these 4 companies I would say are winners. They procured capital funds abroad. So you're not depending on funding from Asia even necessarily. They're going to SoftBank, Google, Alibaba to get money when they want to sort of like develop, right? Technological leapfrogging. So this is something that happened in Kenya, other parts of Africa as well. It's all about using smartphones to like increase your business. So a lot of like app-based things, and all these companies are app-based, and they're like growing into different industries through mobile phones. Localized service. This is one of my favorite stories. Grab versus Uber. If you're familiar with this story, basically Uber tried to Grab is a local company, kind of like, they're in Indonesia, Singapore, and some other Southeast Asian countries. Uber tried to like get the business there. They really failed because they failed to localize. So when you're thinking about like Indonesia, it's a lot of islands, and Grab was, they were there longer. They like had a lot of like local business people already, riders using the app. So Uber really failed. They put a lot of money, and at the end of like 3 years or 4 years, they kind of like got out of the area. So really learn to like localize your service if you want to be sticky. And lastly, smart mergers and expansion. So a lot of these companies are expanding. So it starts with a ride-hailing app. And as you see progress, as you get more money, they're going into payments, food delivery, grocery shopping. Gojek is like a really great example. I mean, there are like 17 things you can do within that app, including like cleaning your car. So, I mean, it kind of like depends on the market. As they go into new markets, they see opportunities, they're growing just based on that. And these are some lessons from like Nepal. And I think a lot of these like companies that I talk to are actually learning from, again, not learning from Uber specifically, but a lot from these like regional players. I actually talked about this in my midterm review, so I'm not going to go in detail, but they're doing like really cool things where I would say the takeaway is really like, they're using culture, they're using the penetration of technology in different fields to really figure out the solution that work for the area. Okay, so in terms of like takeaway, so my goal was to sort of like, I started by thinking that I'll come up with all the solutions. I think that's really hard, especially when you're thinking about like, trying to solve world problems. So my, I guess like final result really is a questionnaire that I created that is a first step guide. So if you are entrepreneur in any of these like, sort of like frontier economies, before you start putting your own money into starting your business, I think there's a couple of like really key things you need to think about. I really have bucketed this relating to like, legal, weak institutions, norms, human capital, product market fit, technology, capital related questions. So these are all sort of like takeaways from the interviews that I did. And I think these are like very critical questions to like kind of like think about as you're moving in, just because I think having the answers to these questions or even thinking about these questions will allow you to better understand the constraints that you have. And once you have those constraints, my hope is that you are able to then align with the right companies within your geography or maybe somewhere else in the world who have faced similar constraints, and then think about, okay, how did they overcome those constraints, right? So that's sort of like my product of my project. And lastly, one thing that I really didn't think about when I was doing a research for my project But then something that, as we talked in CDS about AI, I also suggest that entrepreneurs should like actively think about how AI can advance, help, and then overcome barriers. And a specific example here is that when I talk to somebody from Tavisi, which is like a Etsy-style e-commerce market in Nepal, the biggest complaint there was like, they were trying to hire talent in like different industries, different departments, so like marketing, but they will have somebody and the person will kind of leave. So the question is like, can you get AI to like do all your marketing promotions, right? It's going to be much cheaper. You don't have to worry about high turnover. So something to like think about in the future as well as we, think more about AI in general as the world. Yeah. And thank you. Question and comments.
This is great. Thank you so much for this presentation. One thing that comes to mind is for the companies that you mentioned that were successful, those. Yeah. What do you know about their management and their education background?
Yeah.
Because I'm curious how education, especially if individuals are educated in the U.S. And they have these, goal of maybe solving some problem back in their own country, or they have an affinity for that country, they want to go back. How much of that plays an influence in some of the pitfalls and challenges versus maybe individuals who are educated in their own country where they weren't necessarily influenced by perhaps this need to replicate what is in the U.S. and emerging markets?
That's a great question. So I don't specifically remember if it is Gojek or Grab. I forget. But then I think a lot of these countries, people are educated sort of like in US or like adjacent. And I think it's like this thing of like, I'll be a small fish in US. I want to be a bigger fish back home. I think it's like a very prevalent phenomenon, at least I know in India. So they might not completely replicate the whole thing, but then they understand their market better. So a lot of people, Stanford Business, don't graduate, they go back to India. And a lot of them have like, founded unicorns. So that's definitely like a factor, yeah.
Sorry, from your research that you've done, how do these firms compete against like well-funded FDI, like companies like Uber, right? Like what are some key success factors that you've seen?
So I think with at least these companies from the research that I did, I think in what has happened is international companies Uber, Amazon have tried to come and take their market share. And a lot of times they have failed. Again, the problem is localization. I don't think they understand the market well. And these companies, even though they're smaller, might not have the same amount of money, they do understand their market and a lot of like loyalty, language, like all these like stickiness. So because of that, they have won a lot of these battles, at least the ones that I read about. But then there's also another thing that is happening, which is like quite interesting, is like, goes back to like smart mergers and expansion, is that when they cannot beat them, they join them. So a lot of times they will maybe buy some equity in these companies because they are growing really fast. So I think the idea is like, okay, you try to like get the whole market. If not, you're gonna like join them. Yeah.
I had a question about one of the examples you gave, like when we were talking about Grab versus Uber, and I think to the question asked earlier. I'm thinking, for example, like in Pakistan, there's a company called Careem, highly localized. Later on, it was acquired by Uber, and I think you talked about the importance of localization. I'm just curious to see, like, given some of the companies you've been looking at, what kind of like, if for the big players that can't localize, like, I feel like acquisition can also be like another strategy. I'm just curious if you saw any of that happening in the space, or like as companies are as startups are developing, like how that factors into play. Because I've seen that as a strategy, for example, with what Kareem just mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like a play. And like again, what I said to Rahul, I think what is it? Was it Ola? I think you guys can maybe talk a little more about it. There was a fight. I think they lost. Uber lost. Is that how you would say it? Yeah. So I think acquisition is very possible. One thing that it's like, at least in the geopolitical context, is very interesting is that there's a power play between companies from the West versus China. So if you're getting acquired, I think the question is who's acquiring you? There's a lot of money coming. I mean, I don't know about right now, but there was a lot of money coming in, at least in that region from China. Alibaba and other countries were trying to like get that access to that market. So acquisition definitely possible, but some of the times if you are backed by some like foreign FDI where you might not need that money, I think they're more. They might be more. They might want to go with sort of like Chinese investors versus like US, just because I think at least with Uber, I think they just did very poorly in a lot of these companies. When they went in, they had a lot of like problems from a security issue as well. So they really didn't win that fight. Yeah.
Maybe not a question, but just some experience. I've been on the kind of government advisory side of this, and I think shifting the equilibrium of just like local language, bad user experience for small businesses or startups. I think both the funding for that and the kind of expertise for that is very widely available. So if you're keen converting this into something that is kind of government facing, that is, hey, we just need to translate some of these forms into English, for example, I think that'll be a very powerful thing to come out of this. So if you're interested in that direction, happy to help in any way.
I will send some entrepreneurs your way. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any questions? No. Okay. Thank you, guys.